Understand that truthful and blunt are two different words. You can tell the truth without damaging somebody in many cases. So don't take from this that you got to go out and start beating people up routinely. You know, occasionally you need to beat them up, but a lot of times you can tell them the truth in a way that is much more palatable than you're a stupid sinner and you look like a baboon and you stink. That's why truth is hard. If it were easy, everybody would do it. If you start making truth your way, you will eventually come up against the soul trait that is out of balance, that is causing you to want to lie, which is why you want to learn to think about what you're thinking about. So when you're tempted to lie, which we all are periodically, you can look under the hood and you can see why it is that you're tempted to lie under the circumstances. And that's an important insight. So, where we are is we have done all of the traits, with the exception of strength, interestingly, that were in the course that we did 4 years ago. So now there are different labels and different ones in the book, for those of you who have the book. So we are going to go off into the book, and today we are going to do silence. Rabbi Wolbe, the craft of a person in this world is to behave as if mute. The craft is not to be a babbler. This is something one has to learn, since once a baby learns how to talk, he babbles as it pleases him. And don't get me wrong, everybody is delighted when their child learns to talk until they get to the why stage. But the point is, learning to talk is not hard. It's something that people are designed to do. The thing that is hard is learning to be quiet. Now, there's 3 aspects of silence. First one is called Shemos HaLashon, which is guarding the tongue. And that is watching what you say. The next one is Som Shitakah, which is a fast of silence. And then there's Hitbodedut, which is solitude. And we'll talk about each one of those 3. First one is guarding the tongue. And there's a couple of readings for Proverbs. A brother offended is more unyielding than a strong city, and quarreling is like the bars of a castle. You were all talking about aspects of this as we were discussing truth. How do you decide what to say to your brother so that you don't make of him an enemy, but still speak truth? And then from the fruit of a man's mouth, his stomach is satisfied. He is satisfied by the yield of his lips. And then the one that everybody knows is death and life are in the power of the tongue. And those who love it will eat its fruits. Now, you all have been at this long enough that you know that God created the universe with speech. So speech is extremely powerful. And God has given us authority here. He has made us speaking spirits. So the words that we speak are powerful. Now, we've got a couple of books by the Hofetz Haim. One is Guarding the Tongue, and the other one is The Power of Positive Speech. The rabbis have studied speech extensively, and quite frankly, they have a much better grasp of it than do most Christians. Part of this is, since words have power, they should be used wisely. Going back to our original slide, talking about a babbler, is someone whose mouth just runs constantly. What's going to happen inevitably with someone like that is he is going to wind up uttering words that are damaging. And so the rabbinic perspective, with which I temperamentally agree, since I am an introvert and quiet by nature, the only time I ever talk is in here with you guys. Ask my wife. And temperamentally, it's appealing to me, the rabbinic emphasis on silence, because I do it a lot. If you're temperamentally one who chatters, then it becomes something that you have to learn to discipline. Those of us who are introverts and naturally silent tend to do better here simply because we don't say very much. Not necessarily that we're very wise, we don't say very much anyway, so we have less opportunities to get ourselves into trouble. This is from the Hofetz Haim. And Hofetz Haim, as I say, has got volumes written on this. And I've distilled it into 4 broad categories. And of course, the Hofetz Haim books have example after example after example of each of these. So the first one is negative or degrading statements about a person which are true. Now, I don't know about you, but I got some stuff about me that I would just assume that you didn't know about because I'd be embarrassed. And I suspect that most of us have things about ourselves that are private. And we would just really rather that they weren't talked about, if for no other reason that if you knew what I was like in private, you would think less of me. So perhaps the most damaging of degrading statements are those that are true. And you have to differentiate between legal and spiritual, because in law, if you slander someone, you speak derogatorily about them. And in law, a defense against slander is what I said was true. So if I can prove that what I said about you is true, then I cannot be prosecuted for slander. But I have committed lashon hara. I have committed evil against you, and I have committed evil speech, even though it's not actionable in law. If I were a lousy tipper and never left a tip, and my wife was the only one that knew about it, for her then to say in front of this crowd, he's a lousy tipper, brings me down, causes me embarrassment, even though I'm not going to tip anymore. I'm still going to be a lousy tipper, but I just don't want you to know about it. In fact, there's a rabbinic story you've probably all heard. In a village, some guy was badmouthing the rabbi. And somebody jerked him up short and says, you shouldn't do that. And he realized what he was doing and went to the rabbi and said, I have to ask you to forgive me. I repent. I have been saying bad things about you. I am sorry, and I ask for your forgiveness. And the rabbi says, bring me a pillow. So the guy brings him a pillow, and the rabbi opens the seam and throws the feathers up into the wind. And he says, now, I want you to go pick up every one of those feathers. And of course, it's impossible, because the feathers will go everywhere. They'll go off into the woods. And the point with lashon hara is you may repent of it, you may try and correct the damage, but you can't, because once it's out there, it just keeps going. So the second case is negative statements that are false. Those are actionable in a court of law, depending on what kind of damage you do. Gossip is passing on negative statements that someone else said. So if I go to Galen and I say to Galen, Kay told me this about Evelyn, that's gossip. Neither Kay nor Evelyn is in the room. But I'm saying to Galen that Kay told me this about Evelyn. That's gossip. And the idea is the statement that I have said casts Evelyn in a bad light somehow. And then the final one is statements that imply negativity. This is what's called damning with faint praise. He speaks pretty well for an Okie. In other words, everything I have said is sort of positive. That's what we're talking about there. Oh, he really does better than you would expect looking at him. Technically, it's a positive statement, but in fact, it's not. Lashon hara, which is negative speech, harms 3. It harms the one who's spoken about. It harms the one who hears, and it harms the one who speaks. And there's a rabbinic story, which is fake but true. 2 rabbis getting up in age, and they each promised the other that when he died, they would come back and tell the other what it was like. So one of them died and came to the other one in a dream several days later. And the one who was dreaming says, well, what was it like? And he says, well, God's judgment is far more precise than anything we imagine here on earth. And the worst thing is improper speech. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. Given that God created everything with words, and He made us in His image, the misuse of words from God's perspective is very serious. It's like giving dynamite to a 3-year-old. I'll give you a broad definition of Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is negative speech to no good purpose. So, if we were voting and she were running again, I would say to you all, under no circumstances should you vote for Hillary Clinton. She is a spawn of Satan. That's negative speech. But it is for a purpose. There is a reason why I'm doing that. I am warning you about this woman, and I'm saying your vote for her would be very unwise. So that's very clearly negative speech, but it's for a good purpose. If you were to go to Patricia and say, Patricia, you snake, stepped on my dog, that is also negative speech, but it is negative speech for a purpose. What you're doing is you're going to Patricia and you're explaining to her that she has harmed you and you're giving her an opportunity to make it right. If, however, you are to come to Kay and say, Patricia stepped on my dog, and my dog will now no longer guide me on the street anymore because he's terrified that Patricia will show up, that would be gossip and that would be forbidden. Again, the classic example is if Mark was about to go into business with Mike. And I, having had business dealings with Mike in the past, know that Mike has got sticky fingers. So I would go tell Mark, I understand you're planning to go in business with Mike. If you decide to do that, you need to make sure that you get a good accountant to protect yourself. That is permissible speech. That is negative about Mike to Mark, but it is by way of warning him not to step into a potentially bad situation, or if he decides to step into that situation, to have his eyes open. So there's lots of cases where negative speech is not only appropriate, it's required. So it is not the case that all negative speech is prohibited. I said it very carefully. I said negative speech that has no useful purpose. Negative speech that has no useful purpose is forbidden. There are circumstances where negative speech is appropriate. But understand that my speech about Mike to Mark is negative about Mike. I am sowing distrust of Mike in Mark's eyes by saying that, regardless of how I phrase it. You really ought to make sure you get a good accountant. There isn't any way I can say that is not going to reflect badly on Mike. But sometimes it's necessary. That's what I'm saying. And one last thing I'll say about Lashon Hara. When we go through Lashon Hara, and we've gone through it once every year or two, the first thing that everybody wants to learn, what are the exceptions? And the point of learning about this stuff is to recognize that everybody's tendency is to want to gossip. We all do. And the discipline then is to learn to recognize it, learn to shut it down in most cases, and then at that point you are ready to learn the exceptions and you can open it back up a little bit. All right, moving along. Silence from 1 Kings. After the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. You, of course, all recognize that is Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And he goes and God does all of these magnificent signs. You got storms and earthquakes and all that kind of stuff. And we as humans associate those things with gods. Notice I said that. Gods. That's the reason that people associate gods with all those phenomena. You have a god of thunder and you have all that kind of stuff. And what is happening here is God is saying, those are not the means by which I talk to you. Instead, you have a low whisper. And the deal about a low whisper is you have to be quiet to hear it. I heard a preacher some time ago, had a friend that was, one of these very loud, demonstrable guys, always talking and waving and stuff like that. And the loud guy was saying, Yeah, when I'm out jogging, I just get these messages from God. And the other preacher says, God, how come you talk to him while he's jogging and you don't talk to me while I'm jogging? And God says, it's the only time he's quiet. Another one from Psalms, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations and I will be exalted on the earth. And again, notice the be still. We used to have Army field telephones. And you had what's called a push-to-talk switch. So when you wanted to talk, you pushed the switch and you talked. And then you turned loose of the switch so you could listen. If the switch was down, you couldn't listen because it was simplex. It only worked in one direction at a time. So the one who was talking was not listening and, in fact, couldn't be interrupted until he released the switch. And when you're dealing with God, if you're talking, you're not listening. Now, the other part of that is we live in a noise-saturated world. You've got TV, you've got your computers, you've got your talk radio, you've got cars driving all over the place. This whole world is saturated with noise and activity. It's a giant attention trap. So in order to become still before God, you have to, in many cases, get away. That's why people go up on the top of the mountain, so that there are no distractions. That's why I like going hunting. For me, it's mostly just armed hiking, walking out through the woods. Talmudic. There's no better medicine than silence. And the idea of getting out and away from all of the activity and busyness that we're all involved with and just getting into God's presence. Being in the presence of God is healing. It's also the time that He can talk to you. Now, there's two ways that you can do it. One is what on the first slide we call a fast of silence. And that's usually for some short period of time. I mean, you may set yourself a time during the day. So a fast of silence is just getting away by yourself for a short period of time. And that's very good, and I recommend it. The other one is becoming a hermit for a more extended period of time. Certainly becoming a hermit is very much alive in the Christian tradition. Hermits used to go out, and they go out into the desert or up on a mountain or something like that. I mean, it's become a cartoon cliche. But people that withdraw from the world for an extended period of time. In fact, there's a story in your book about a rabbi that was convinced that he needed to become silent, and he had himself bricked up into a room for 2 years. And his only communication was food and water through a window. He withdrew from the world for a 2-year period. One of the things that you see as you walk through a town is you see people with earbuds in their ears, and they're staring at their phone. These are people who are not comfortable being alone with their own thoughts. So when you withdraw for a period, you are alone with just you and God. And there are lots and lots of people in our society for whom that's very frightening. And so they always have a set of earbuds in, and they're always looking at their phone for text messages or whatever it is they're looking for, and they are never isolated and silent. So that's one end of your spectrum, if you will. People who are never alone with their own thoughts and God. And then, of course, at the other end is the word today would be autistic. Somebody who is completely closed in within himself. That's what an autistic person is. Someone who is closed within himself and cannot communicate with the world. And both of those are not good. And certainly there are people who are not clinically autistic who are on that end of the spectrum. In the book, what we're talking about is someone that is on the other extreme, who has got the earbuds in and walking around looking at his cell phone all the time, who is finally overwhelmed and say, what I need here is a complete break for a while and a fast to get myself out of the other end of the spectrum, so that when I finally come out of my fast, maybe a 2-year fast, I will be somewhat better centered than I am now. It's sort of like me with dieting. I don't diet very well at all. I can fast. In fact, they did a 40-day fast once. And fasting is cool. Dieting, just a failure at, because there's always the temptation for a cookie, or there's always the temptation for, sticking my head in the refrigerator and all that kind of stuff. So I'm sort of slam on either end. I can fast, or I can just do whatever I want, but I don't seem to have much range in between. So in my case, in order to lose weight, I'd say, we're going to do a fast for a few days. And I do. And I can see someone who's got his earbuds in his cell phone saying, I need a fast because I am not able to back off on the distractions. And remember, God is whispering to you. And if you got your earbuds in and you got your cell phone going and you got all that stuff going, you can't hear the whisper. It's designed to drown that stuff out. That's what these things are all designed to do. In fact, your book says, often the loudest thing in your world is your own mind. It is very, very hard for me to sit for 15 minutes in silence because my mind starts going off in all directions. And part of silence is to learn to damp that stuff down too. So if you're in the process of working on something where you're concentrating on something, you're not doing that. You're certainly better off than if you had earbuds jammed in your ears and the music going in the shop and all that kind of stuff. You're better off than that, but it's not quite the same thing. Your exercise, potential phrase, be still and know that He is God. Be silent and in silence for a time each day. Notice how I said that. Be silent and in silence. Those are two different things. Being silent is closing your own mouth. Being in silence is isolating yourself from all of the noise and stuff that flows around you, to include the clatter of wrenches. One of the things, when my dad was still alive, he was a 2-day drive from here. He was in eastern Washington. And I used to look forward to that drive because I'd usually put on some good music and I'd just sort of zone out, and it's a long straight interstate across Wyoming and Montana, but it isn't quite the same. That's not the exercise, but I understand that that can be very peaceful. Your attention is not really on God so much. You do need to pay attention to the road, or you do need to pay attention to what you're doing. That's what you're avoiding. You're going to avoid multitasking for a week.